The morning air hung heavy with anticipation as thousands of spectators lined the ceremonial plaza outside Buckingham Palace. Among them stood families, tourists, and dignitaries, all gathered for the annual Remembrance Day ceremony. The crowd buzzed with quiet conversation, but an unusual tension seemed to ripple through the gathering. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres adjusted his dress blue uniform one final time. The fabric felt foreign against his skin after months in combat fatigues. His chest displayed ribbons earned through 3 tours in Afghanistan, each one representing nights he preferred not to remember. The Purple Heart sat prominently among them, a reminder of the shrapnel that nearly took his left leg in Kandahar. Michael had arrived in London just 2 days earlier as part of a special diplomatic exchange program. The United States Marine Corps had selected him to represent American forces at the ceremony, an honor that felt both overwhelming and bittersweet. His younger brother Danny should have been standing here instead. Danny had always dreamed of visiting London, of seeing the changing of the guard, of experiencing the pageantry that Michael found uncomfortable. The crowd parted slightly as Michael made his way toward the designated area for military representatives. Children pointed at his uniform, their parents explaining in hushed tones about the different branches of service. An elderly woman caught his eye and nodded respectfully. Her weathered hands clutched a small photograph of a young man in uniform, clearly from a different era. Across the plaza, Lance Corporal James Windsor of the Coldstream Guards stood at perfect attention. His red tunic was immaculate, every button polished to mirror brightness. The bearskin hat added nearly a foot to his already impressive height. James had been preparing for this moment for weeks, knowing that today would be different from the usual tourist-filled ceremonies. James came from a military family that traced its service back 4 generations. His great-grandfather had fought in the trenches of World War I, his grandfather had stormed the beaches of Normandy, and his father had served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. The weight of that legacy pressed down on James's shoulders like the heavy uniform he wore with such pride. The palace gates gleamed in the autumn sunlight as both men found themselves positioned near the memorial wreath area. Neither had been formally introduced, but each recognized the other's bearing immediately. Military men possess an ability to identify their own kind across cultural and national boundaries. Michael noticed the British guardsman first. Something about the man's posture spoke of real experience beyond ceremonial duties. The way James held his rifle, the slight weathering around his eyes, the almost imperceptible favoring of his right foot, suggested someone who had seen action. Michael's own combat instincts, honed through countless patrols in hostile territory, rarely failed him when reading people. James, meanwhile, observed the American Marine with equal interest. The ribbons on Michael's chest told a story of courage and sacrifice. The way the Marine carried himself suggested someone comfortable with responsibility and familiar with loss. There was something in Michael's eyes that James recognized from his own mirror after returning from his tour in Helmand Province. The ceremony began with the familiar notes of a bugle call. The crowd fell silent as military units began their processional. Michael watched the precision of the British Guards with professional appreciation. Every movement was synchronized, every step measured. This was military pageantry at its finest, a display of discipline that transcended mere showmanship. As the wreaths were laid and prayers were offered, both men found themselves reflecting on absent friends. Michael thought of his unit in Afghanistan, particularly Corporal Rodriguez, who had died trying to save a wounded Afghan child. James remembered Private Thompson, barely 19, who had stepped on an improvised explosive device while on patrol outside Camp Bastion. The formal portion of the ceremony concluded, but neither man moved from his position immediately. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many stopping to take photographs or purchase souvenirs. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for better views of the remaining guards. Tour guides gathered their groups, speaking in multiple languages about the historical significance of what they had witnessed. Michael felt unexpectedly emotional as he watched families reuniting after the ceremony. A young girl ran to her father, still in uniform, who swept her up in his arms. The image reminded him painfully of his own daughter, Emma, whom he had not seen in 6 months due to his deployment schedule. His ex-wife, Sarah, had been understanding about his military commitments, but the strain had ultimately proven too much for their marriage. James noticed the American's expression soften as he watched the family reunion. There was something universal about that longing, that recognition of sacrifice made not just by soldiers, but by their families. James's own girlfriend, Rebecca, had struggled with his deployment to Afghanistan. She had ultimately decided that the uncertainty and fear were too much to bear, ending their engagement just 2 weeks before he returned home. The two men stood perhaps 30 feet apart, each lost in his own thoughts, when something unexpected happened. A small child, no more than 4 years old, broke free from his mother's grasp and ran directly toward the memorial area. The boy was clutching a small toy soldier and seemed determined to place it near the wreaths that had been ceremonially laid. Both Michael and James reacted simultaneously, their military training overriding protocol. The child was approaching the restricted area where security was paramount, but neither man wanted to frighten or roughly handle such a young visitor. They moved with careful precision, positioning themselves to gently redirect the boy back to his worried mother without creating a scene. The moment created an unexpected connection between the two soldiers. Without speaking, they had coordinated their response perfectly, each understanding the other's intentions instinctively. The child's mother arrived quickly, apologizing profusely in accented English while scooping up her son. Both men smiled reassuringly, with James offering a formal nod and Michael giving a thumbs up to the boy, who was now safely in his mother's arms. As the woman walked away, thanking them repeatedly, Michael and James found themselves standing closer together than before. The brief interaction had broken through the formal barrier that military protocol typically maintained. They were no longer just representatives of their respective nations, but two veterans who had shared a moment of common purpose. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plaza as the crowd continued to thin. Both men knew they would need to return to their respective duties soon, but something held them in place. Perhaps it was the recognition of shared experience, or the understanding that such moments of connection were rare in their structured military lives. Neither spoke, but both felt the weight of unfinished conversation hanging in the air between them. The silence between Michael and James stretched on, but it was not uncomfortable. Around them, the plaza continued to empty as visitors made their way to nearby attractions or afternoon tea. Street performers had begun setting up near the Victoria Memorial, their music adding a cheerful soundtrack to the increasingly relaxed atmosphere. Michael found himself studying the British guardsman more closely. Despite the formal uniform and rigid posture, there was something approachable about the man. The way James had handled the situation with the child showed a gentleness that spoke well of his character. Michael had served with many soldiers over the years, and he had learned to trust his instincts about people. James was conducting his own assessment of the American Marine. The ribbons on Michael's uniform told a story of multiple deployments and significant combat experience. The Purple Heart particularly caught James's attention, as he bore his own invisible wounds from his time in Afghanistan. There was a steadiness about the Marine that reminded James of his best sergeants, men who could be counted on when situations became difficult. A group of tourists approached, cameras ready, clearly hoping to take photographs with both soldiers. Michael and James exchanged a look that somehow communicated their shared reluctance to become tourist attractions. James gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, and Michael nodded in understanding. Without speaking, they both stepped back slightly. Maintaining their dignity while politely discouraging the photo opportunity. The tourists, sensing the soldiers' reluctance, moved on respectfully. This small interaction further reinforced the growing connection between the two men. They had successfully communicated and coordinated their response without a single word being exchanged. Such understanding typically took weeks or months to develop between military personnel, yet it had emerged naturally in the space of an afternoon. Michael shifted his weight slightly, favoring his left leg without conscious thought. The shrapnel wound still bothered him during long periods of standing, particularly in dress shoes rather than his usual combat boots. James noticed the subtle movement and recognized it immediately. He carried his own physical reminders of combat, including a shoulder that ached whenever rain was approaching. The recognition of shared physical sacrifice created another layer of unspoken understanding between them. Both men had given parts of themselves in service to their countries, and both bore the permanent reminders of that sacrifice. Yet neither displayed any self-pity or sought sympathy. Their wounds were simply part of who they had become. A military chaplain approached the memorial area to offer a final prayer before the site was returned to normal operations. Michael and James both came to attention instinctively, showing respect for the religious observance. The chaplain's words about sacrifice and remembrance seemed to hang in the air between them, adding weight to their silent encounter. As the chaplain finished and moved away, Michael made a subtle gesture toward his chest ribbons, then pointed toward James's uniform with obvious respect. James responded with a formal salute, which Michael returned crisply. The exchange was brief but loaded with meaning. They were acknowledging each other's service and sacrifice across national boundaries. A young reporter approached, notebook in hand, clearly hoping to interview both soldiers about the ceremony and their respective experiences. Michael and James again coordinated their response without words, both politely declining to comment while maintaining their professional bearing. The reporter, perhaps sensing the unique nature of their silent interaction, lingered for a moment before moving on to find other subjects. The afternoon air was growing cooler as autumn asserted itself over London. Both men remained at their posts, but the formal ceremony had long since concluded. Their continued presence seemed to serve a different purpose now, as if they were reluctant to break the connection that had formed between them. Michael thought about the letters he wrote to families of fallen comrades, the careful words he chose to honor their sacrifice while providing comfort to grieving relatives. He wondered what stories James carried, what losses had shaped the serious expression that occasionally crossed the guardsman's face during quiet moments. James reflected on his own experiences writing to the families of soldiers who had not returned from deployment. The responsibility of finding the right words to capture a life cut short was one of the heaviest burdens of military leadership. He sensed that the American Marine carried similar responsibilities and experiences. A maintenance crew began preparing the plaza for normal evening operations, collecting debris and adjusting barriers. The return to routine seemed to emphasize how special their encounter had been. Soon, the ceremonial space would become just another London tourist destination, and their moment of connection would exist only in memory. Michael checked his watch and realized he would need to return to his hotel soon for a diplomatic dinner that evening. Part of his assignment included various social obligations with British military leadership and American embassy staff. These formal events were necessary but draining, requiring him to be constantly on display as a representative of his country. James knew that his duty shift would be ending soon, after which he would return to barracks for equipment maintenance and preparation for the next day's assignments. The routine aspects of military life provided structure and purpose, but they could also feel hollow after experiences like today's ceremony and unexpected encounter. Neither man wanted to be the first to leave, sensing that their departure would mark the end of something significant. The silent communication they had developed felt too valuable to abandon casually, yet both understood the demands of military duty and the impossibility of extending their encounter indefinitely. Michael made a decision that surprised even himself. He reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a small challenge coin from his unit in Afghanistan. The coin bore the emblem of his Marine Expeditionary Force and had been given to him by his commanding officer after a particularly difficult mission. It was one of his most prized possessions. Holding the coin where James could see it, Michael pointed to himself and then to James, clearly indicating his intention to present it as a gift. The gesture was unprecedented in his experience, but it felt completely appropriate given the unique nature of their encounter. James understood the significance immediately. Challenge coins were serious business in military culture, representing unit pride, shared experiences, and mutual respect. He was deeply moved by the American's gesture, but felt he had nothing equivalent to offer in return. Then James remembered the small regimental pin he carried in his pocket, given to him by his grandfather before his first deployment. The pin bore the insignia of the Coldstream Guards and represented 4 generations of his family's military service. It was irreplaceable, but something about this moment demanded an equal gesture. Both men stepped forward slowly, closing the distance between them for the first time since their initial encounter. The exchange of tokens happened quietly, with profound respect evident in every movement. Michael accepted James's pin with obvious reverence, while James held the challenge coin as if it were made of precious metal. The moment felt ceremonial in its own right, perhaps more meaningful than the formal proceedings that had brought them together. They were creating their own ritual of mutual recognition and respect, transcending the boundaries of nationality and military branch through shared understanding of service and sacrifice. The exchange of tokens created a shift in the atmosphere around Michael and James. What had begun as a chance encounter between 2 soldiers had evolved into something approaching a sacred moment. Both men stood holding their new treasures, understanding intuitively that they had just participated in something far beyond normal military protocol. Michael examined the regimental pin in his palm, noting the fine craftsmanship and obvious age of the piece. He could sense the history embedded in the small object, generations of family pride and military tradition condensed into a few grams of metal. The weight of responsibility that came with such a gift was not lost on him. James turned the challenge coin over in his hands. Feeling the raised edges of the emblem and reading the Latin motto inscribed around the border. The coin was warm from Michael's pocket, and James could imagine the battles and hardships it had witnessed. To receive such a personal token from a fellow warrior felt both humbling and empowering. Around them, the plaza had taken on the quieter rhythm of early evening. Street lights began flickering on despite the lingering daylight, and the tourist crowds had largely dispersed to dinner venues and hotel rooms. The changing of the guard ceremony seemed like it had occurred days ago rather than hours. So much had transpired in the silent communication between the 2 soldiers. An elderly veteran approached the memorial area, moving slowly with the aid of a walking stick. His old service medals caught the light as he shuffled forward to pay his respects. Both Michael and James came to attention automatically, recognizing a senior member of the military brotherhood despite his advanced age and civilian clothes. The old man noticed their respectful posture and nodded appreciatively. He spent several minutes at the memorial, clearly lost in memories of comrades who had not returned from long-ago conflicts. When he turned to leave, he paused near Michael and James, looking at each of them with eyes that had seen more than most people could imagine. Without speaking, the veteran reached into his coat pocket and withdrew 2 small poppies, the traditional British symbol of remembrance. He handed one to each of the younger soldiers, his weathered hands trembling slightly with age but his eyes remaining sharp and alert. The gesture carried the weight of generational continuity, linking past sacrifice with present service. Michael and James accepted the poppies with deep reverence, understanding that they had just been blessed by someone who truly understood the cost of military service. The veteran smiled briefly, patted James on the shoulder with obvious affection for a fellow British serviceman, then nodded respectfully to Michael before continuing on his way. The encounter with the veteran seemed to intensify the connection between Michael and James. They had been witnessed and acknowledged by someone whose opinion carried genuine authority in military circles. The old soldier's approval felt like validation of their silent bond and the respect they had shown each other throughout the afternoon. James carefully attached his poppy to his uniform, following the traditional placement he had learned as a young recruit. The bright red flower stood out dramatically against his scarlet tunic, serving as a visible reminder of the sacrifice and loss that military service inevitably entailed. He had worn poppies many times before, but this one felt particularly significant. Michael pinned his poppy to his dress blue uniform with equal care, though he was less familiar with British traditions surrounding the flower. The gesture felt appropriate nonetheless, a way of honoring not just British traditions, but the universal nature of military sacrifice that transcended national boundaries. A light rain began to fall, typical of London autumn weather. Neither soldier moved to seek shelter, instead standing their ground with the stoicism that military training instilled. The rain added a melancholy beauty to the scene, washing the plaza clean while highlighting the solemnity of their continued vigil. Michael found himself thinking about the men he had served with who would never experience moments like this. Rodriguez, who had died trying to save that Afghan child, would have appreciated the ceremony and the connection with a fellow warrior from another country. The thought brought both sadness and gratitude for being alive to carry on such traditions. James reflected on his own lost comrades, particularly Private Thompson, whose enthusiasm for military service had never been diminished by the harsh realities of combat. Thompson had always spoken about the honor of serving alongside allies from other nations, and James felt certain he would have been moved by this encounter with the American Marine. The rain continued to fall steadily, creating small rivers that carried fallen leaves across the plaza. Both soldiers remained motionless, their uniforms beginning to show signs of moisture, but their bearing unchanged. They had stood in much worse weather during training and deployment, and a London drizzle posed no real challenge to their comfort or resolve. A young couple passed by, sharing an umbrella and looking curiously at the two soldiers standing in the rain. The woman whispered something to her companion, who nodded and approached Michael and James cautiously. He offered to share their umbrella, speaking with a thick Scottish accent and obvious genuine concern for their welfare. Both soldiers politely declined the offer, but their grateful expressions communicated appreciation for the gesture. The couple lingered for a moment, seeming to sense something special about the scene they had witnessed. The woman smiled warmly before they continued on their way, looking back once more at the two figures maintaining their vigil in the rain. Michael's thoughts turned to his daughter Emma, wondering what she would think of this moment if she could see it. At 8 years old, she was beginning to understand that her father's job was different from other parents' work, but the full weight of military service remained beyond her comprehension. He hoped she would someday appreciate the bonds that connected soldiers across all boundaries. James thought about his nephew Peter, who had recently expressed interest in military service despite his parents' reservations. James wanted the boy to understand that military life involved more than fighting and discipline, that it created connections and experiences that lasted lifetime. This encounter would provide a perfect example of the broader brotherhood that military service fostered. The rain began to lighten, but neither man showed any inclination to leave their posts. The approaching evening brought a different quality of light to the plaza, softer and more contemplative than the bright afternoon sunshine that had illuminated the formal ceremony. The changing conditions seemed to enhance rather than diminish the significance of their continuing presence. Security personnel began their evening patrol of the area, checking that all barriers and equipment were properly secured for the night. They nodded respectfully to Michael and James, Recognizing their military status and understanding their right to remain in the memorial area for as long as they chose. Michael realized that he would soon need to return to his hotel to prepare for the evening's diplomatic obligations. The formal dinner would require him to engage in polite conversation and represent his country in social settings that felt artificial compared to the authentic connection he had discovered with the British guardsman. James knew that his relief would arrive soon to take over evening security duties around the palace grounds. He would then return to barracks for equipment maintenance and preparation for the next day's assignments. Routine tasks that seemed mundane in comparison to the profound experience he had shared with the American Marine. Neither man wanted to break the spell of their encounter, but both understood that military duty demanded their eventual departure. The challenge would be finding a way to honor what they had shared while acknowledging the practical necessities that governed their lives as professional soldiers. The final rays of sunlight broke through the dissipating rain clouds, casting a golden glow across the plaza that seemed to transform the ordinary scene into something almost mystical. Michael and James stood in this natural spotlight, two warriors from different nations united by shared values and mutual respect that required no words to express. Michael made a decision that would stay with him for the rest of his military career. He stepped forward and extended his right hand to James, offering a handshake that would formally conclude their remarkable encounter. The gesture was simple, but loaded with meaning, representing the culmination of hours of silent communication and growing understanding. James accepted the handshake without hesitation, gripping Michael's hand firmly while maintaining direct eye contact. The handshake lasted longer than conventional protocol would suggest, but neither man seemed concerned with formality at this point. They were writing their own rules for a situation that had no precedent in either of their military experiences. As they shook hands, both soldiers felt the weight of everything they had shared without speaking. The mutual respect, the recognition of sacrifice, the acknowledgement of shared burdens, and the appreciation for service rendered in dangerous places far from home. Their handshake somehow contained all of these elements and more. Michael spoke his first words of the entire encounter, his voice quiet but clear in the evening air. "Semper Fidelis," he said simply, offering the Marine Corps motto that meant, "always faithful." The words carried multiple layers of meaning in this context, representing not just loyalty to country and corps, but now extending to include the bond he had formed with this British guardsman. James responded with equal simplicity and profound meaning. "Nulli secundus," he said, quoting the motto of the Coldstream Guards, which meant second to none. Like Michael's words, the phrase carried significance beyond its literal translation, acknowledging excellence in service while honoring the equality he recognized in his new American brother-in-arms. The exchange of mottos felt like the perfect conclusion to their wordless communication. They had managed to distill hours of silent understanding into two brief phrases that captured the essence of military pride, dedication, and mutual recognition. Neither man needed to explain what the words meant, both understanding intuitively the respect being offered and received. They released their handshake slowly, each taking a small step backward while maintaining their military bearing. The formal distance between them returned, but the connection they had forged remained undiminished. They had proven that true understanding between warriors could transcend language, culture, and nationality. Michael's replacement arrived first, a young lieutenant who had been designated to escort him back to his hotel for the evening's diplomatic functions. The lieutenant approached respectfully, clearly aware that he was interrupting something significant but bound by duty to retrieve his charge according to schedule. Michael turned to acknowledge his escort while James came to attention, offering a final salute that Michael returned with equal precision. The salute was held for several seconds longer than regulation required, serving as their final formal communication and a promise that their encounter would be remembered with honor. As Michael prepared to leave with his escort, he touched the regimental pin now affixed to his uniform pocket, a gesture that James noticed and understood completely. James responded by briefly touching the challenge coin he had secured in his own pocket, acknowledging the permanent nature of their exchange and the lasting significance of their meeting. Michael walked away without looking back, his military training preventing any display of emotion that might compromise his dignity or that of the guardsman he was leaving behind. But the straight line of his shoulders and the deliberate pace of his stride spoke of someone carrying new weight, both the physical token he had received and the emotional impact of an unprecedented encounter. James remained at attention until Michael had completely disappeared from view, showing respect for a departing comrade regardless of nationality or service branch. Only then did he allow himself to relax slightly, though he maintained his post as duty required. His relief would arrive soon, but until then he would continue his vigil over the memorial area. The plaza continued to empty as evening approached, but several witnesses to the soldiers' encounter lingered nearby. The elderly woman who had been holding her photograph earlier approached James cautiously, her weathered face showing obvious emotion. She thanked him quietly for his service, mentioning that her son had died in the Falklands conflict and expressing appreciation for seeing such respect between Allied soldiers. A middle-aged man who had been photographing the ceremony from a distance approached and asked permission to share a picture he had taken of Michael and James during their handshake. He explained that he was a military historian and had never witnessed such a powerful display of international military brotherhood. James politely declined permission for publication, but thanked the man for recognizing the significance of what he had witnessed. James's relief arrived precisely on schedule. A young guardsman who had heard rumors about the extraordinary encounter that had taken place during the ceremony. James briefed him on routine security matters, but said nothing about his personal experience with the American Marine, understanding that some things were too sacred to share casually. Before leaving his post, James took one final look at the memorial area where he had spent the most meaningful afternoon of his military career. The wreaths laid during the ceremony remained fresh and dignified, serving as reminders of the sacrifice and service that had brought him and Michael together in mutual understanding. Michael arrived at his hotel with just enough time to change into evening dress uniform before the diplomatic dinner. As he prepared for the formal event, he found himself thinking not about the speeches and ceremonies that awaited him, but about the silent guardsman who had given him a gift more valuable than any medal or commendation. The dinner proceeded according to protocol, with appropriate toasts, formal presentations, and diplomatic conversations about military cooperation between allied nations. Michael participated fully in all required activities, but part of his mind remained fixed on the plaza, where he had discovered that the strongest bonds between soldiers required no words at all. James returned to barracks and completed his evening duties with characteristic efficiency, maintaining his equipment and preparing for the next day's assignments. His fellow guardsmen noticed something different about him, but respected his privacy enough not to inquire directly about his obviously meaningful experience. That night, both men lay in their respective beds thinking about their encounter and the profound connection they had forged without speaking. Michael held the regimental pin, feeling its weight and thinking about the generations of British soldiers who had carried similar tokens into battle. James kept the challenge coin on his bedside table, where the last thing he saw before sleeping was the emblem of American Marines who had fought in distant mountains he had never seen. Neither man knew whether they would ever meet again, but both understood that their encounter had changed them permanently. They had discovered that military service created bonds that transcended all artificial boundaries, and that true understanding between warriors required no language other than mutual respect and shared recognition of sacrifice. The story of their wordless encounter would be told quietly in military circles for years to come, inspiring other soldiers to recognize the universal nature of military service and the brotherhood that connected all those who had answered their nation's call to arms. Without speaking a single word to each other, Michael and James had written a chapter in the continuing story of international military cooperation and mutual respect that would outlast both of their careers. In the years that followed, both men would carry the tokens they had received as reminders of a perfect moment when language proved unnecessary and understanding flowed freely between kindred spirits who happened to wear different uniforms but shared identical hearts.